A misfortune, more devastating than any other, suddenly struck two elderly women, like a thundercloud on a clear day. Their only children, the daughter of Faith, her ray of hope, and the only son of Madelyn, her pride and support, were gone. Their love tragically cut short in a car accident. This misfortune, contrary to expectations, did not bring the two mothers closer. Their relationship, even when their children were alive, was not warm. After the children's wedding, a silent competition arose. Each secretly believed her child deserved greater happiness, thinking the other half was not good enough. Communication was strained, more so from Madelyn, who desired to be the best in everything, seeking to prove her superiority over Faith. Faith carefully hid her true feelings, minimizing interactions. Even the birth of their grandson, little Troy, could not melt the ice in their relationship. Each grandmother secretly considered herself more knowledgeable in raising him, adding to the tension. But neither woman could have imagined burying their children together. At that moment, Troy had just turned 2. The thought of an orphanage never arose. Troy had 2 grandmothers. Surprisingly, Madelyn unexpectedly said with resignation, "You, Faith, take the child. You are younger. I am unwell." "Of course, Madelyn," Faith quietly agreed. She thought it better if Madelyn forgot them. Troy deeply felt the loss of his parents, needing quiet care. Little Troy seemed not to fully grasp the loss, but the absence of his parents was felt. Grandma Faith, kind and patient, wrapped her grandson in the warmth of her love, trying to explain the inexplicable with fragile words. "Mum and Dad love you very much, Troy. They watch over you from heaven and protect you." But these words were faint in his grief. His tiny consciousness sank into silence. Before, he had been chatty. Now the house was silent. Grandma Madelyn, observing her grandson's silent suffering, curled her lips in a contemptuous smirk. "Well, it's clear." A sarcastic judgment flashed through her mind. He turned out to be a fool, just like his mother, probably. What else could that empty-headed woman give birth to? And my son, an angel, probably died because of her. He was such a good driver. No accidents, no fines. But she must have distracted him with her senseless chatter or rushed him, always in a hurry. And now... Faith's heart ached for Troy, and she took him to a doctor. "Severe stress." The doctor sighed. "Reactive muteness. Don't pressure him. Just talk. Create calm. It should pass." But time passed, and Troy remained silent. Faith sought various doctors and healers to no avail. She learned to understand his every gesture. Their bond became telepathic. But to others, Troy remained a mystery. Madelyn became more and more convinced that her grandson was simply mentally challenged. "I don't know what you're waiting for, Faith," she said coldly. "The boy clearly has psychological issues. He needs to be seen by good specialists." "Do you really think I haven't done that?" Faith replied bitterly. "We've already seen every doctor in the city and surrounding areas. No one can help." "Then he should be placed in a special kindergarten for children like him," Madelyn said categorically. "You can't torment yourself like this for the rest of your life." "For what kind of children? He's normal, he's just grieving. We communicate perfectly," Faith retorted. "Great," Madelyn thought sarcastically. "A crazy old woman raising an idiot. I shouldn't have let her take him." Returning home, Madelyn swallowed bitter tears. "Oh, my son, why did you leave? Why marry her? Now there's no normal heir. Our family line has ended," she thought despairingly. Faith, indeed, learned to understand her grandson with just a glance or a slight gesture. A barely noticeable raise of an eyebrow or a slight tilt of the head was enough for her to instantly grasp his desires or mood. Their bond was delicate, almost mystical, as if two hearts beat in unison, despite the silence of one. But the wise woman understood that little Troy needed to connect with the bustling, multifaceted world and learn to interact with others. She often took his small hand in her warm ones and whispered softly, "Try, my dear. Try to say something out loud. First to me, quietly in my ear, and then, you'll see, it will become easier to speak with others." Her voice was gentle and persuasive, like the murmur of a stream. "People need to hear you and understand you, Troy. Otherwise, they won't know how smart and kind you are. It will be hard for you without communication, little one." There was no talk of sending Troy to kindergarten. How could they accept a child who was silent as an enigma? Even the most renowned speech therapists and psychologists, whose offices were usually filled with children's laughter and chatter, were at a loss when faced with his stubborn silence. Time passed, taking days and months with it, but the silence around Troy remained unchanged. Years slipped by unnoticed, and soon it was time for school. Madelyn, of course, could not stay out of it, her concern once again manifesting in a sarcastic tone. "Of course he has no place in a regular school," she declared authoritatively, pursing her thin lips. "He'll only disturb the other children and annoy the teachers with his silence. I've heard there's a special institution for special children. That's where he should go." "How can you say such a thing, Madelyn?" Faith replied with pain in her voice. "He's not special. He's smarter than many. He just can't express his thoughts with words. But the doctors say there's hope. He just needs time." "Hope? How many years have I been hearing this?" Madelyn retorted sarcastically. "And what do you plan to do? Keep communicating with him through gestures? Keep him at home, uneducated?" "No, he'll have home education. I've already looked into it. It's quite possible," Faith said firmly. "Troy is a very capable boy. He already knows and can do a lot." "And don't talk about your own grandson like that. He's not special. Especially not in front of him. He hears and understands everything, even if he doesn't speak." "You're not as simple as you seem," Madelyn thought maliciously, glancing at her daughter-in-law's new blouse. "Receiving guardian payments, child benefits, living comfortably, doing nothing. Every time I visit, she has something new, and the child has been silent for 5 years. What a wonderful home education this is." "We'll see who agrees to teach him," she muttered aloud. "If the child is just as strange, he'll only torment the teachers. I can't bear to watch this. I won't visit you any more. I don't need such relatives." Faith felt relieved hearing these words. Each visit from Madelyn left a bitter aftertaste, and her harsh remarks about Troy seemed to only worsen his condition. Indeed, there were no signs of improvement, although no one doubted the clarity of the boy's mind. Soon, teachers began coming to their home for lessons, and to Faith's surprise, they even praised Troy for his diligence and progress. But despite all the efforts of the teachers and the boundless love of his grandmother, little Troy still lived in a world of silence. He had locked away his voice, and nothing could make it break free, whether he couldn't or wouldn't. This invisible barrier prevented him from connecting with his peers. His only friend remained Grandma Faith, who had learned to understand him without a single word, sensing every movement of his soul. Faith's heart ached at the thought of what would happen to Troy when she was gone. These fears grew more real and palpable with each passing day. Faith's health was deteriorating rapidly. Worn down by grief from the loss of her daughter and constant worry for her grandson, her heart was failing more frequently. Consumed by her concerns for Troy, she paid no attention to her own health, postponing doctor visits for later, for someday. Deep down she knew that treatment was unlikely to help, the problem too great. One day, mustering her last bit of strength, she decided to take a final step. She visited Madelyn. Entering the tidy but somehow cold apartment, Faith invited her mother-in-law for a frank conversation. "Madelyn, I wanted to talk to you about something. My health is really failing," she began, struggling to find the right words. I'm afraid of leaving Troy alone." "Oh dear, what are you saying? At our age, what strength do we have left? I can barely move my legs myself." Madelyn waved her off, not looking up from her knitting. "One thing hurts, then another. Last night my leg cramped up. I thought I'd scream from the pain." Madelyn seemed not to hear, or rather chose not to hear, the subtle hint from Faith. "And you've taken on such a burden," she said with a touch of reproach. "How's Troy doing? Still silent as a criminal under investigation? Hasn't started speaking like a normal person?" "No, Madelyn," Faith sighed bitterly, "and I'm afraid of what will happen to him if something happens to me." "Oh, don't talk like that. It's too early to think about such things. We still have many years ahead of us. What are our ages? I'm 2 years older than you, and I'm still going strong. Look, I bought this Korean cream for wrinkles. Expensive, of course, but they say it's miraculous. You should try it too. A woman should never forget about herself, especially at our age." "Yes, you look great, Madelyn," Faith forced herself to say. "You could get married tomorrow, but that's not what I'm talking about." "See? And you're always so gloomy," Madelyn interrupted her. "I want to know what will happen to Troy. Will you take care of him after I'm gone?" Faith asked directly, looking Madelyn straight in the eyes. "Oh, here we go again. I'm talking about life and you're talking about death. You can't talk like that, Faith. Maybe I'll go before you. That's usually how it happens. One crows, the other dies." Madelyn finally looked up from her knitting and regarded Faith with a cold indifference. "As for Troy, I said back then he should be placed in some special institution. They would have taught him to speak and interact with people by now." "But he's our grandson, Madelyn, the son of our deceased children." "I remember he's our grandson, but you've shut me out of his life. I say the wrong things. I do everything wrong. You and he whisper in your own language." "So, I can't count on you?" Faith said coldly, rising from her chair, feeling the last glimmer of hope fading from her heart. "Count on me for what? According to you, he can't talk. He doesn't recognize me. So think about how you can count on me. One thing is clear, I won't abandon him, but how much I can help, I don't know." "Goodbye, Madelyn," Faith said softly, and with a heavy heart full of darkness and despair, made her way home. Faith felt her strength waning inexorably, and her only plea to the heavens was, "Lord, help me hold on at least until Troy reaches adulthood." She was terrified at the thought of her silent grandson being left alone and defenceless in this big, often cruel world. "How will he live alone, my poor boy?" she whispered into the emptiness of the room, but her sorrowful words seemed to fall on deaf ears. When Troy turned 11, Faith's heart stopped beating. Her old friends took care of the funeral arrangements, and her only relative, Madelyn, attended the ceremony with a stone-faced expression, as if fulfilling an unpleasant duty. After the funeral, Faith's friends anxiously asked Madelyn if she planned to take custody of the orphaned grandson. "Oh, my dears," Madelyn waved them off, wearily closing her eyes. "I myself go to bed every evening, not knowing if I'll wake up in the morning. I'm exhausted. My blood pressure is all over the place. Everything hurts. Sometimes I think it would be better if... My nerves are shot. I've endured so much grief, buried so many. She sighed and continued, How can I take care of a boy who isn't entirely well himself? And if I die, it will be another trauma for him. Let professionals take care of him. Poor Faith, she pampered him, and only made things worse with her kindness. The boy doesn't speak, can't learn. The tragedy of losing his beloved grandmother had a devastating impact on Troy. The boy seemed frozen in his grief, plunging into a silent abyss of despair. He silently endured his loss, shying away from the unfamiliar hands, trying to comfort him, pat his head or squeeze his hand. Deep down, he was not stupid. He read a lot, thought deeply, and his inner world was rich and complex. Sometimes he felt like he was ready to speak, that the words were about to burst from his lips, but some unknown force seemed to constrict his throat, paralyzing his tongue. And after his grandmother's death, it became even more pointless. Who would he talk to? About what? The news that his other grandmother, whom he had never truly considered a relative, refused to take custody of him did not upset Troy. In fact, it was almost a relief. He vividly remembered her harsh words, her disdainful looks, and how his grandmother Faith suffered and took sedatives after each of her visits. I won't go with her. I'd rather run away and live on my own somehow, he thought, feeling a bitter sense of loneliness rising within him. At least I'm not as small and helpless as I was after my parents died. But he had no idea how to live alone. As it turned out, he didn't have to. Soon after the funeral, some unfamiliar but rather pleasant women came to their now empty home. They introduced themselves as social workers and were there to decide his future. "What's your name, boy? How old are you? Can't you speak at all? Can you write? How did you communicate with your grandmother?" Troy could write. Letters formed words, and words formed sentences, full of his thoughts and feelings. He didn't feel any animosity towards these women. Their kindness was evident in every gesture, every look. But he still didn't want to speak. Unable to get a single word out of him, the women exchanged understanding glances and drew their conclusions. "Probably autism," one of them said softly. "His intellect might be intact, but the boy doesn't speak. Likely not literate either, although he seems calm, just very depressed. I think we'll have to transfer him to a specialized children's home for kids with similar conditions." "Yes, there's no other way," the second woman agreed. "Maybe there they can provide the necessary help and somehow correct his behavior. After all, he's 11 years old. Adult life is just around the corner." Troy did not resist. Nothing could be worse than the abyss of grief he had already endured. And this new home didn't seem scary at all. In fact, a faint hope for change flickered in his silent consciousness. In his imagination, Troy already saw a spacious room filled with silence, where children like him, quiet boys and girls lost in their thoughts and activities, lived. He pictured them sitting at large tables, engrossed in drawing, moulding colourful clay, or flipping through the pages of books, without disturbing the fragile atmosphere of peace. At night, they would retreat to small cosy rooms, sleeping in pairs, as if sharing their silent loneliness. Troy even imagined a roommate for himself, a boy with kind eyes who had become his friend, almost a brother. "We'll be together," he dreamed, "and maybe one day, when the pain eases a little, we might want to talk, to share with each other how we ended up alone in this world." As Troy packed his few belongings, he carefully hid his most precious possessions among his clothes, photos of his parents and his beloved grandmother Faith. He tucked them into an old worn-out book of fairy tales, as if trying to protect a piece of his past from prying eyes. The woman from social services who was watching him pack thoughtfully remarked, "The boy seems to have his intellect intact, as far as I can tell. Isn't it too early to send him to a specialized institution?" Her colleague shrugged. "He doesn't speak. Who knows what's going on in his head? He barely reacts to anything. And what are we supposed to do with that? The specialists there will figure it out. No regular orphanage will take him." So, Troy was sent to the mysterious special institution, where strangers were supposed to figure out his silence. He didn't yet understand that his timid dreams of a quiet haven might be shattered by the harsh reality. The journey was long and exhausting. Troy's new home turned out to be far outside the city. The building itself looked rather grim, with peeling paint on the walls, but the surrounding area, with its lopsided swings and dilapidated sandbox, didn't seem particularly frightening. Inside, they were greeted by a heavy-set woman in a greasy robe, her face etched with displeasure. "Another new one, huh?" she muttered, giving Troy a lazy once-over. "At least he can walk. Can he feed himself? Use the toilet?" "He can do all that. He just doesn't speak," the social worker accompanying Troy explained. "He might be autistic. Let's go fill out the paperwork." Half an hour later, Troy, dressed in a grey institutional uniform, became one of the many wards of this strange establishment. The caretaker took his book with the photos, despite his timid resistance. "We'll put it in the cabinet for safekeeping, and we'll give it back when you're older," she reassured him indifferently. "If you take it to the group, they'll snatch it and tear it up. What do you have in here? Photos? They'll be safer here. Out there they'll steal everything in no time." She spoke loudly and clearly, as if talking to someone hard of hearing. "Can you hear at all?" Troy nodded and silently handed over the photo album, feeling his little heart constrict. He heard everything, including the strange, muffled sounds coming from behind a large closed door at the end of the hallway. Someone's muffled screams, a child's crying, and the shrill, piercing voice of another adult woman. His dreams of a quiet life among other silent children seemed unlikely to come true. The caretaker led him into a large, bright room filled with a strange chaos. At first glance there was nothing frightening. A worn rug on the floor, bright but shabby furniture, shelves crammed with mismatched toys and tattered books, and the children, about 10 boys and girls around his age. But they weren't sitting quietly at tables, drawing or reading. In one corner, a boy in a wheelchair cried inconsolably. 2 others lay on the floor, muttering incoherently, while several more ran around the room, screaming wildly. In the corner of a large room, like a bird of prey in a cage, sat a woman in a snow-white robe, whose shouts frequently echoed through the room, interrupting the children's voices and antics. "Hey, no running!" her voice boomed. "Break my toy and I'll tear your arms off! Everyone, attention! Quiet down immediately! We have a newcomer!" She approached Troy, her gaze cold and unfeeling. After listening to the quiet whisper of the accompanying women, she roughly took Troy by the hand and turned him to face the now silent, wary children. Their eyes curiously examined the stranger. "Meet Troy. He doesn't speak, but he hears everything. He's your new friend, and don't you dare bully him. Understood?" "But how will he complain if he doesn't speak?" a freckled boy shouted cheekily, hiding a smirk. "I'll see for myself," the caretaker snapped. "I won't leave you unsupervised.
"Don't worry, new kid, I've got my eye on you. All right, go, make friends. Do whatever you want. Just don't misbehave or break anything. Got it?"
Troy nodded silently, feeling the piercing gazes on him. He wanted nothing more than to blend into the noisy room, to become invisible. The loud crowd of children didn't scare him so much as it made him feel deeply tired. After the caretaker's brief speech, most of the children lost interest in the silent newcomer. Only a few of the more curious ones circled around him, examining him from all sides, as if he were some exotic creature. One of them, finding nothing more interesting to do, started poking Troy with a broken toy, trying to provoke a reaction. Troy couldn't take it anymore. He swatted the toy away, inadvertently pushing the annoying boy. "Ow, he's hitting me!" The boy immediately wailed dramatically, clutching his shoulder. "He doesn't talk, but he hits. He pushed me hard."
"It's forbidden,"
the caretaker shouted, but she didn't move from her spot, continuing to watch the scene with an indifferent expression. And Troy realized with bitterness that he didn't like this place at all. And with each passing hour, this feeling grew stronger. It turned out that he wouldn't be sleeping in a cozy room for two, as he had hoped, but in a large, stuffy dormitory where younger children who cried in their sleep and older, sullen kids all slept together. He could never get a good night's sleep. Every night, someone's crying or screams would disrupt the silence. The days were no easier. Troy found it unbearably difficult to get used to the constant presence of so many strangers. Moreover, he couldn't manage his own time here. Everything was dictated by a strict routine, with loud commands preceding every action. In the morning, at the very hour when sleep was sweetest and deepest, the children were roughly awakened, hurried to wash up, do pointless exercises, and eat a rushed breakfast. Being alone and immersed in his thoughts was impossible. He made no friends. "Mute, weirdo, dumb," the other children called him these names with disdain, sensing his detachment. Some avoided him, feeling his otherness, but there were those who found pleasure in teasing, offending, and provoking fights, only to then call the caretaker and blame everything on the silent outcast, who doesn't like others and bothers everyone. In desperation, Troy tried to use gestures to explain his innocence to the caretakers, but this only provoked their irritation. So, Troy had no friends or protectors, and more, the desperate thought of escape grew in his mind. He didn't know what he would do once free, but he desperately wanted to be far away from this hated place. However, escaping proved not so easy. The orphanage territory was surrounded by a high, impassable fence. The children were constantly watched by caretakers during their walks, and the children themselves, accustomed to the rules, were ready to raise the alarm at any moment. "The mute is going to the fence! He wants to climb out!" Yet one day, Troy took an opportunity for escape. In one secluded spot not far from the gate stood an old plywood structure resembling either a toy train or a fairy tale house, which conveniently obscured the view from the caretakers. It was in this spot, right under the fence, that Troy accidentally discovered a small burrow, perhaps made by stray dogs seeking shelter. Troy's thin and agile body slipped through the narrow gap under the fence with unexpected ease. The world beyond the fence, which had seemed like an impregnable obstacle, suddenly opened up, releasing him into freedom. It all happened so simply and quickly that the boy himself didn't fully grasp what had happened. What to do next? Where to go? These questions didn't yet occupy his mind, overshadowed by one intoxicating feeling: freedom. Moving away from the hated grey walls, Troy simply ran. Not from anyone in particular, but revelling in the sensation of running, the ability to choose his direction without obeying someone else's will. However, freedom turned out to be fleeting. They noticed his runaway quickly, raised the alarm, and soon a report of the missing ward from the special institution was filed at the local police station. The search began. Troy hoped to reach a big city, where it would be easier to get lost in the crowd, but he didn't make it. He was intercepted by patrol officers on the outskirts and, without a word, returned to the grim caretakers.
"So, Troy, why did you run away? What didn't you like here?" The head caretaker interrogated him, looking at him with tired irritation, as if forgetting that the boy couldn't answer, even if he wanted to. Then, with a heavy sigh, she placed a blank sheet of paper in front of him and handed him a pen. "Fine, then write down what you didn't like."
Troy looked down at the white sheet, paused for a moment, and then wrote in large, angular letters, "Everything." This was followed by a long, tedious lecture about good adults who take care for children left without parents, and about the state, which does everything possible to make the lives of those in its care comfortable. Troy listened half-heartedly, realizing that this escape attempt wouldn't be his last, and he was already mentally planning how to better prepare for the next one. But how could he prepare? At most, he could think about the route, come up with at least an approximate plan of action. He had no maps and he couldn't ask for advice, not only because of his muteness, but also because there was no one to trust here. All he could do was be more careful, try not to get caught by the police. So, at the first convenient opportunity, Troy slipped through the familiar hole under the fence again. And there he was, free again, small, mute, in institutional clothes, as if washed ashore on an unfamiliar beach. They could have caught him within a few hours, but this time luck was on his side. He found his way to the city by following the bus stop and route sign. It turned out that the city wasn't that far away. He made it there in a couple of hours. But to survive on the outside, he needed a place to sleep and something to eat. He wasn't particularly hungry yet. Troy had managed to grab a roll from the breakfast, which he slowly chewed on the way. Evening was approaching, and the question of where to spend the night became urgent. On the outskirts of the city, there were plenty of abandoned houses, with broken windows and tilted roofs. Entering them was scary, but the boy still decided to do it. One of the buildings looked less grim and dilapidated. The door creaked, but was open. Troy cautiously entered. Walking down the dark corridor, he peeked into one of the rooms. It was empty, except for an old, dusty table in the middle and a sagging sofa with torn upholstery against the wall. The boy wearily sat down on the sofa, spread his thin jacket under his head, and without realizing it, fell into a deep sleep. Troy woke up a couple of hours later, in the middle of the night. His stomach growled with hunger, and his mouth was dry. But it wasn't hunger that woke him. There was someone else in the house. He could clearly hear voices. At first, Troy rose in fear, his heart pounding in his chest, but then he listened more closely. The voices were clearly those of children, boys, loud and carefree. Some kids were talking in the next room, unaware of his presence. The fear subsided a little, replaced by cautious curiosity. Troy quietly got up from the sofa and tiptoed out of the room. The door to the adjacent room was slightly ajar, and a faint light filtered through, casting eerie shadows on the walls of the corridor. Little Troy cautiously approached the slightly open door and peeked through the narrow gap. In the large, cluttered room, a group of boys around his age were indeed sitting on the floor. Before them, right on a dirty newspaper, was some modest food, and nearby were open bottles of cheap soda and water. Troy involuntarily swallowed, and gathering his courage, he stepped inside.
"Oh, who do we have here?" one of the boys snorted, looking Troy up and down. "Who are you, and where did you come from?"
Oh, how Troy wished he could speak now, but he remained silent. Instead of words, he first pointed to the bottle of water, then ran his hand across his throat, showing that he wanted a drink.
"Hey, he's mute, guys," the blonde-haired boy laughed. "Want a drink? Here you go."
He handed Troy the open bottle.
"Why are you giving away everything?"
Another boy grumbled discontentedly.
"Let him go back where he came from and drink as much as he wants there."
"Oh, come on," the blonde-haired boy said placatingly.
"Look at how he's dressed. He's probably run away from the orphanage. Drink up, don't be afraid. And here, eat if you're hungry. What's your name?"
Troy greedily drank from the bottle of lemonade, feeling the sweet liquid quench his tormenting thirst. Then he looked around for something to write on, found a piece of cardboard, and gestured that he needed a pencil. One of the boys tossed him an old ballpoint pen. With trembling hands, Troy wrote on the cardboard. "I'm Troy. I don't speak, but I hear, and I understand everything. I ran away from the children's home. I don't know what to do next. Can I stay with you?"
"Well, why not?" said one, the oldest of the group, apparently the leader. "We're all either run away or something else, so you can stay with us. But what are we going to do with you? We have to fend for ourselves."
"Oh, he can beg for alms," the youngest, a skinny boy with cunning eyes, suggested.
"Why not? He can write on a piece of cardboard, 'Deaf, mute, orphan, hungry,' and sit by the market. Old ladies will give him money and food."
"What do you say?" the blonde-haired boy asked the oldest one. The idea didn't fill Troy with enthusiasm, but how else could he get food? And then he would see. Maybe these guys would find him some other, more enjoyable occupation. But no enjoyable task was found, which Troy was secretly glad about, because from snippets of conversations with his new acquaintances, he understood that they made a living from petty theft. Troy felt a deep aversion to such methods of obtaining even the most necessary things. Moreover, it was a sure path to jail. So he spent whole days sitting with his piece of cardboard by the market, and it was a bit shameful. He was healthy, strong, with arms and legs, and could have earned an honest living. But where and how, Troy didn't know. If only I could grow up faster, he often thought, seeing no other way out of his humiliating existence except growing older. Returning to the children's home was out of the question for Troy, but he didn't like the streets either. Among the homeless, there was no real friendship. Their group was constantly changing, either falling apart or taking in new kids, not all of whom treated the mute boy kindly. Soon summer will end, the cold will come, and then what? He thought sadly. One day, on a weekday, tired of sitting near the market, Troy went to a quiet park and sat down on a bench, lost in his gloomy thoughts. Along the path, a not-so-young but distinguished-looking man was walking unsteadily towards him, holding his chest as if in pain. Drunk? No, more likely sick, Troy thought. Reaching the bench, the old man almost collapsed onto it and whispered hoarsely, "Water! Please, cold water!" Troy instantly jumped up and ran to a small nearby store. With trembling hands, he dumped all his change onto the counter and desperately pointed to a small bottle of water. Getting it, he rushed back to the man. He opened the bottle and placed it in the man's weak hand, but he immediately realized that water alone wouldn't help. The man's face was pale as a sheet and his lips were turning blue. What could a little homeless boy do? Troy rushed to a few passers-by, desperately grabbing their sleeves, trying to draw attention to the dying man on the bench. But it was in vain.
Everyone recoiled from the poorly dressed mute child with dirty hands, pulling their arms away from his grasping fingers. At the very moment when despair was almost overwhelming him, Troy distinctly heard the voice of his grandmother Faith, spoken long ago. "Speak aloud, Troy, otherwise no one will hear you." And the boy, surprisingly, even to himself, let out a desperate cry that broke from his lips after years of silence. "Help! There's a man dying over there! Call an ambulance! I don't have a phone!" His cry, full of horror and pleading, was heard. Someone passing by, alarmed by his desperation, quickly dialed the emergency number. 10 agonizing minutes later, an ambulance arrived and took the man to the hospital. Troy watched the receding red lights and whispered to himself, barely believing his own ears. "I can speak. I can speak." He didn't yet know that on this day and at this hour, he not only regained his lost ability to speak, but also took his first step, albeit unconsciously, toward completely changing his joyless life. Though it didn't happen as quickly as he would have liked. The next 2 months of Troy's life on the streets were not much different from before. Yes, now he could speak, but who cared? Whom could he talk to? Other outcasts like himself? They might think he had been faking his muteness before and take offence. And offended street kids are unpredictable and dangerous. Besides, the habit of silence was stronger than the fleeting miracle. Winter came, freezing the city with its icy breath. Surviving in abandoned houses became almost impossible. Troy desperately tried to warm himself with rags and cardboard found in the trash, but it wasn't enough. Finding a good spot for begging became harder too. He was chased away from his usual spots by vigilant police or more successful colleagues. He had no money at all, not even for a piece of stale bread. On one freezing evening, Troy stood near expensive stores, hoping for the sympathy of wealthy passers-by. But he wasn't allowed to stay there for long either. The security guard of one of the boutiques scowled and roughly drove the frozen boy away, spoiling the respectable appearance of the establishment. At that moment, an elegantly dressed middle-aged man emerged from the store. He glanced briefly at the miserable frozen face of the teenager and suddenly froze, as if struck by lightning. Then he addressed the security guard in an authoritative tone. "Don't touch him. I'll take him with me." The man approached Troy and placed a firm but gentle hand on his shoulder. "Come on, kid, don't be afraid. Don't you recognize me?" Troy, out of habit, shook his head distrustfully. He didn't recognize this man, though something in his face seemed vaguely familiar, a distant memory from a past life. "But I can't forget you," the man said softly, looking into his eyes. "Never mind, I'll explain everything later. Let's go home now." What does this mean? Home where? Why does this rich man seem so familiar? Questions swirled in Troy's mind, but he was too exhausted to wonder or resist. He hadn't slept or eaten in a long time, and in any case, he would have soon fallen asleep right on the street, in the cold wind, possibly forever. The magical word home drained his last strength, but kindled a faint spark of hope for warmth and safety. The man took him to a large, luxurious house and led him to a spacious room, which the boy barely had time to glance at through his haze of exhaustion. "Get undressed, throw your things over there in the corner and go to bed," the man said wearily. "You can hardly stand. What's your name?" "Troy," the boy replied in a hoarse voice, raspy from long silence, gazing enchanted at the real bed with its snow-white linens. Could he really be about to lie down on it? Without undressing, he simply collapsed onto the soft mattress, wrapped himself in the light but surprisingly warm blanket, and instantly fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The exhausted boy slept for almost a full day. Waking up, he looked around in amazement at the luxurious room with its high ceilings and elegant furniture, trying to remember how he had ended up there. While he was struggling to piece together the events of the previous day, the door quietly opened, and a kind-looking middle-aged woman in a snow-white apron entered. "Good evening," she said cheerfully, as if she had known him for years. "Here is your new clothing, and here is everything you need to freshen up. Come, I'll show you the bathroom, and then you can have dinner. Mr. Morgan will be here in 2 hours." "Who?" Troy asked in a voice hoarse from sleep and long silence, feeling a surge of anxiety. "The master of the house. Come with me." In the large, bright bathroom filled with the scent of expensive soap and freshness, Troy finally felt human again. The hot water washed not only the dirt of the streets from his body, but also seemed to cleanse some of the heaviness that had accumulated in his soul over the long months of wandering. He thoroughly washed his tangled hair, and for the first time in a long time looked at his reflection in the large mirror. Clean and refreshed, he stepped out of the bathroom. The word dinner sounded sweetly in his ears, as he had long forgotten the taste of real food. When the transformed Troy followed the kind housekeeper downstairs, his nostrils caught the delightful aromas wafting from the kitchen. His stomach painfully clenched with hunger. He shyly sat down at the large kitchen table and saw a plate full of appetizing food in front of him. Forgetting all table manners, he greedily devoured the food like a wild animal. As he consumed everything the housekeeper served him, he didn't notice the lady of the house watching the scene with horror and disgust from the doorway. It was only when Troy reached the sweet dessert that the master of the house returned, but the first to greet him was his tense wife. "Edgar, I don't understand what this means," she began coldly from the doorway. "Who have you brought into our home?" "This is Troy. Has he woken up?" Edgar asked wearily, taking off his coat. "Yes, he slept all evening, all night and all day. And what if this Troy is some kind of drug addict or thief? Right now he's in the kitchen gobbling. Excuse the expression, but this process can't be called eating. He's just devouring everything in sight like a starving wolf." "Do you naively think that after a person nearly dies of hunger and cold on the street, their manners should be impeccable?" Edgar replied with irony in his voice. "Gabriella, this boy saved my life. When I had a heart attack right on the street, he was the one who didn't panic, gave me water and called an ambulance. I've been searching for him ever since, and am overjoyed I found him. I can't leave him in the same situation. I owe it to him to do everything possible to help him get his life back on track." "Of course, you always do whatever you want," Gabriella said resentfully, pursing her lips. "And my opinion, as always, means nothing to you. I am nothing more than an object named Gabriella to you." With these words, she turned around and left, slamming the door behind her. Edgar entered the kitchen just as Troy finished the dessert, looking at the smiling housekeeper with gratitude. The man shared the story of how they had met years ago, and then Troy recounted his life and how that incident had been a miracle for him. He began to speak openly, his words pouring out like a river, breaking through a dam. They were so engrossed in the conversation that they didn't notice Gabriella standing in the kitchen doorway. She listened to the boy's story, quietly wiping away tears, her heart aching for the struggles he had endured. Thus, the fate of the homeless orphan Troy was unexpectedly resolved. All day after meeting the boy, Edgar agonized over how best to arrange his future life. But that evening, listening to his soft voice and seeing his grateful gaze, he made a completely unexpected decision. He decided to to adopt Troy. Their many years of childless marriage had often led them to consider adoption, but there had always been reasons to postpone this important step. Now, their potential son had seemingly come to their home on his own, and refusing this would be simply unreasonable. It can't be said that everything went completely smoothly. At almost 12 years old, Troy had never spent a day behind a school desk, barely knew his letters, and struggled with simple arithmetic. But this problem was solved rapidly. Edgar hired the best tutors for Troy, and the intelligent boy eagerly threw himself into his studies, quickly catching up and even surpassing his peers. Relations with his new parents also developed surprisingly well. Troy became adapted to his new, happy life, where he had everything he could ever have dreamed of. A cosy home, a loving family, real friends, and a bright, promising future.